Welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy panel. Today's panel takes three wildly disparate books. We've got fantasy steeped in folklore and tradition, a science fiction novel with talking animals, bioengineering, and lots of war, and finally Shakespeare's Star Wars, which is probably the most unique retelling I've seen yet. And I have an 8-year-old, so I've seen every version of Star Wars there is. Science and fiction and fantasy, sometimes referred to by the umbrella term speculative fiction, although I know that's contentious, so we don't have to go there, is my favorite section in any library or bookstore. It's where I found myself as a teen reader. Not because it's a literal window, much less a mirror. I don't have magic powers. I've given up hope for that Hogwarts or Breakbill's letter. I'm not going to outer space. But it's a metaphorical window. It's an opportunity to see the world through a lens that sometimes, like a prism, breaks out the things that are important and makes them seem more true and more real. It offers worlds of possibility with every page, and I've always thought that it was more true for having fewer facts. As an educator, it's also the section that I find speaks most to my marginalized students, but also probably is just the section that speaks most to my students. You can find war, romance, adventure, tensions between class, tensions between race. You can find mystery, you can find magic, you can find new frontiers, both literal and figurative. It's pretty much everything you could want in one section. So, now you know why we're here. Let me introduce our three authors. Robert Repino, and it's good that they all said their names in case I was going to get them wrong, is the author of Morte. His short fiction has appeared in a number of literary journals, among them the Literary Review, Night Train, and Hobart. Morte is his first novel, but he also has a novella out. In his day job, Robert is an editor at Oxford University Press, but that's actually just a cover for his true passion, which is pitching for the Oxford University Press softball team. Ian Doescher is the author of the 6 Shakespeare-styled retellings of Star Wars, so that's the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. Personally, I'm more partial to the original, but they're all fantastic. These are homage, parody, the perfect gift book. I actually have given them as gifts a number of times. And they are sort of canon meets pop culture in iambic pentameter, so it's a pretty impressive achievement. Ian's in town from Portland, where he works in marketing as his day job, another creative endeavor. And finally, we have Naomi Novik. Naomi's name is probably familiar to most of you, whether you are a new fan or have been reading the highly lauded, award-winning Temeraire series for nearly 10 years now.
It's been 12 years for me as a writer. So.
That's a long time. So now you have to switch and talk about something totally new today, right? Her latest book, Uprooted, is a totally different type of story, although it still has a dragon. In this case, a human, mostly one. Naomi lives in New York with entirely too many computers and was raised on Polish folk and fairy tales. Also, Naomi and Ian were both at Comic-Con this weekend, so please treat them tenderly. So, thank you all and welcome. Okay, so the first thing I have to ask you, and I swear we don't have a manual for moderators, but it's actually one of the questions David asked, so I feel like I'm losing all originality points. But I was going to ask you to say a little bit more about your books because I've just given such a bare bones overview of each of your works. So, Naomi, we'll start with you. If you could just speak about Uprooted.
So let's see, Uprooted came basically, actually, I have to talk about the Temeraire books a little bit to explain because I wrote Uprooted essentially when I was procrastinating from the Temeraire books. The Temeraire books treat dragons as very realist creatures. There's no magic in the books, and they are very deeply grounded in the actual history of the Napoleonic Wars. But I grew up on sort of these wonderful fairy tales of, the traditional legend of the dragon who's the monster who steals the maiden, and I really always wanted to write that kind of dragon. So I started writing Uprooted, and the first line is, "Our dragon doesn't eat the girls he takes." And basically, I wrote that one line because in reaction, essentially, to writing the very historical, very realist dragons in the Temeraire series. And from there on, as the book grew, it turned out to be in what I call my 5-year-old version of Poland. Because I grew up reading Polish fairy tales and hearing Polish lullabies and legends. And so I had this very vivid impression of Poland as a magical country where there were fairies around every corner, where you had these deep, mysterious woods. And it turned out that Uprooted was set in that magical country that doesn't actually exist, but was deeply real to me as a 5-year-old. And so I've tried to make that land come alive in Uprooted for other people.
Excellent. Let's just jump out of order, Robert. I know, mixing it up.
So Morte is a story about a war between humans and animals. And in this war, the war is triggered by this. This is where you might feel free to giggle a little bit. It's okay. The war is triggered by this very intelligent colony of ants, and their queen has decided that she's going to wipe out all the humans. And in order to do that, she injects this hormone into the water supply that turns all of the animals on the planet into sentient creatures. They can walk, they grow hands, they can speak, they form cultures, and they're out to kill humans. So all hell breaks loose. In the midst of all this insanity, and after most of the humans have been wiped out, there's a house cat who, while he was still a pet, became very good friends with this dog. And in the aftermath of the war, he goes on this journey looking for the dog. So, and he soon finds out that looking for the dog will eventually lead him to an explanation of what this war was all about and what the fate of all the creatures of the earth is going to be. So it's supposed to speak a lot about war and politics. It's also supposed to be kind of a love story, although a very odd one because it's a neutered cat and his dog friend. So it also talks a lot about just the power of dogma to sort of bring people together for both good things and bad things. So yeah, I think that's.
Yeah.
So the plot of my books is pretty complicated. There starts off with this young kid named Luke Skywalker. So what I did was I took the 6 Star Wars movies and rewrote them all as though they were plays by Shakespeare. So they're in iambic pentameter. They're separated into 5 acts. The characters have asides and soliloquies, and yeah, that's what they are.
I really thought as I was reading these books, I know the panel wasn't put together for me, but it felt a little bit that way because I felt like Uprooted spoke to my heart, Shakespeare, Star Wars spoke to my family, and Morte really spoke to my head. There's so much to engage with there on an intellectual level, although I didn't always find it's about a war. It's not always a fun read, but it's a really thought-provoking and provocative read. So, okay, now that you're warmed up, I have yet another question that seems to be copying David's list of questions. I promise I'm going to break out really soon. But I wanted you to talk about the books that shaped you as a child or adolescent. So the books that were the books of your childhood, the books of your teen years. You don't have to talk about how you behaved in school, though, so I'm letting you off easy. Robert, we'll start on your end.
Well, I'm actually embarrassed to say that there was a huge gap in my reading years, right? I was sort of, I ended up not reading for a few years in there, and then one day, there was a blizzard in Pennsylvania. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, and there was a blizzard, and I ended up being stuck in the house for like a week, and ended up pulling out Stephen King's The Drawing of the Three, which is the second book in the Dark Tower series. And I lost my mind reading it. And I mean that in a good way, because I was in the house, like, in my sweatpants for like 4 days, like, and I got back into reading as a result of that. And any attempt to be like, no, I don't read books, whatever, that was completely gone, and from then on I was reading. I guess some other ones, real quick, would, as an adolescent specifically, you know, I came across a lot of those like sort of like condensed versions of H.G. Wells books that have a lot of pictures in them that keep a 12-year-old boy reading. So they did have a huge influence on me. So I'll stop there because there's too many other examples. So
We've got time. You sure?
no, we'll go. We'll be here all day. So let's.
I also was not a big reader as a kid. Not till after college. But the two things that I'll say, Lord of the Flies, captured me as a 6th grader when I first read it, and I still read it every 3 or 4 years. Now that I have 2 sons who are 10 and 12, it holds a new significance for me.
A new horrifying.
Yeah, that's right. And so And then, I mean, Shakespeare, you know, for me, when I got into high school, my freshman year, when we started learning about Shakespeare, I had a theater background, so here we were reading a play in English class, and it was around the same time that Kenneth Branagh came out with Much Ado About Nothing, so it's just a great time to be a young person learning about Shakespeare, and so he's been a passion ever since.
So, you know, I grew up with these Polish fairy tales, but because my parents were both immigrants, they didn't have kind of a stable of English language favorite books that they passed on to me, like I'm now passing my favorites on to my child. So I found my own reading in the library. I found one of the early books that I remember finding was the Tamora Pierce books, the Alana books, which I think are just magical for a young woman, especially. I read that when I was 10 or so. Robin McKinley's books, especially The Hero in the Crown and the Blue Sword, Patricia McKillip, Ursula Le Guin. These were sort of my foundational writers. Anne McCaffrey was a huge influence. And also Tolkien, which was interesting because I read Tolkien very young. I read Tolkien when I was 6 years old for the first time. And I read it because it was in the house. And I would literally read anything that was in range. There was no point in my time when I was not reading just crazy amounts of books. As you might imagine, at 6 years old, a lot of it went over my head. I didn't actually process it, but it kind of got me started on a habit of rereading. And so I have reread Tolkien almost every year. And so I kind of have the experience of learning more and getting more out of the book every year as I got older. And so that book has changed for me a lot. I'm trying to think of, there's so many, I can't list all of them. Jane Austen, I have to, Georgette Heyer, you know, who I think is also just fantastic.
Excellent. Okay, so now that you're warmed up, now I have a hard question for you. So I mentioned before that one of the things I've always admired in genre writing, and in specifically science fiction and fantasy, not mystery, that other genre, is a way that an author can tell a truer story than what might be available in a more realistic piece of fiction. This is not always the popular opinion of critics, right? Science fiction and fantasy still get a little bit of like, I mean, teachers, I'm sure you all recognize this, like, I get asked if I can help children not read genre fiction anymore occasionally. Like, get them onto the real stuff. It's time for them to read something good. All of the hairs on the back of my neck go up because, of course, you're writing amazing stuff, and it is good, and it is so meaningful. But I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about, if you have an opinion, why speculative fiction gets a bad rap, and why you write it despite the fact that you are perhaps swimming against the tide. And what do you wish all of our audience members here knew about reading genre or writing genre or inhabiting that world?
Oh, okay. So just in one line, right?
Yeah.
One sentence answers.
No, this is the one I'm hoping will take the rest of the day. So go crazy.
Okay. Wow. All right. So I think for me, it's actually not an option not to write speculative fiction because, frankly, a lot of times I watch a show or I read a book that doesn't have speculative fiction in it, doesn't have some aspect of sort of wonder or magic and what if something else completely different happened, and I keep reading sort of thinking like, all right, so when are the aliens going to land? Because, you know, I think that there are a few things that speculative fiction does, that it sort of makes you look at the world differently because it forces you to imagine the world as radically different. It forces you to imagine a world that is removed from our own in such dramatic ways that I think it makes you reconsider the world that you then come back to when you get out of it. I think that that's a hugely valuable thing. I feel like let's throw it around.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Sure, I'll go.
I'm still thinking.
Okay, so am I, but I'll talk anyway, why not? I wonder if the bias in favor of so-called literary fiction is coming mainly from the artists themselves who are producing it or from the publishers who are publishing it. And I don't know. Either way, both of those groups of people, and obviously there's a lot of overlap, both of those groups of people still represent a very narrow slice of our society. And I wonder how much of a role that plays in sort of silencing voices that might look at things a little differently. You know, I mean, I come from, I went to an MFA program, and MFA programs are very biased in favor of literary fiction, and understandably so. A lot of people asked, you know, well, why don't we focus more on literary fiction? And the answer, and it's an answer I think is easily defended, is, well, look, literary fiction does tend to focus more on character development, and if you can do that, then you can write in any setting, whether it's on this planet or some other one. Okay, fine. But it was interesting to see the examples where that went too far. I remember this one guy in one of my workshops was writing a story that opened with a man who was absolutely distraught because some guy had killed his family and then killed himself. And in a moment of complete insanity, he digs up the other guy's body. This is the opening line of the story. Digs up the other guy's body and shoots the corpse's head off with a shotgun. If that doesn't get your attention, I don't know what will. But we spent the rest of the workshop, all the people in the class, including the professor, trying to convince him to change that. And to have the opening of the story be the family sitting in the breakfast nook talking about their feelings or something. And I was like, ugh, this is where literary fiction goes wrong. This is like such a bad move here. Like, why not have something that's a little, I mean, yeah, it's schlocky and maybe we could talk about fixing it, but the automatic sort of stiff-arming of it and saying like, no, that's too plot-driven, that's too, you're trying to get my, no. Like that, it's hard to determine where that's coming from and where, all right, I have more to say about that. But
you know, I do actually think like there's of course a long tradition, right, in saying that art that is more distanced from the body and from visceral emotion is better, right? That the more intellectualized something is, the more far away it is, the better it is, and you know that kind of position, you know, philosophically is something that I really reject. You know, I want art that feels very visceral, but often people feel a little bit embarrassed sometimes about embracing art that either makes you, you know, like horror, makes you vividly scared, or for that matter, pornography makes you vividly aroused, or something that makes you just, makes you so intensely engaged with it, emotionally or imaginatively. You know, I myself started writing fan fiction. That's how I got my start as a writer. And the idea that people, you know, people in even the science fiction and fantasy community looked down on fan fiction quite a lot for a while because it was seen as you loved it too much. You should be writing your own stuff that you could sell. Mm-hmm. It wasn't okay to be writing these stories just for the pleasure of writing and just for the pleasure of sharing it with the community.
Could I say one more thing? Real quick. Some authors that I really admire, like Margaret Atwood, for example, and a few others, have written these amazing science fiction stories and then have later said it actually isn't genre. And that isn't helping either. I know Ursula Le Guin, who you mentioned, who I love as well. Yeah. I know she's given a few interviews where she's talked about like I've told Margaret Atwood, Maggie, just admit that it's science fiction, and she won't. So anyway, throw that out there too.
Yeah.
Ian, I think when you answer, I'd also like to hear you talk about fan fiction, since you could be said to have written the ultimate work of fan fiction.
Gosh. So it's hard to. It's funny because when I sat down to write these books, I didn't think of myself as writing science fiction. I didn't think of myself as writing fan fiction, though fundamentally I'm doing both. And so I think, I mean, one of the joys for me in getting to write the book that I wrote was, here's a science fiction movie that we all know and love, and or space opera, whatever you want to call it, and I get to inject more emotion into it. I get to think, okay, when Luke Skywalker is staring out at the double suns of Tatooine, thinking about whether or not he's going to leave his uncle and his aunt, you know, in the movie, he just stands there silently and looks, and you get to imagine what he's thinking, which would never happen in Shakespeare. The person's going to have a soliloquy about it, right? Yeah, I mean, right? Why replace with silence, or why put in silence when you can have more words? And so to get inside the characters' heads, and to give voice to R2-D2 and see what he's thinking, was for me, I guess, trying to pull out the emotions more. And I also didn't think of it as fan fiction, though of course it is, right? I mean, I'm a fan of the Star Wars movies, and I'm a fan of Shakespeare, so it's double fan fiction, right? So I can't poo-poo fan fiction at all because here I am enjoying it. Yeah, I don't know. These are I'm torn because I actually have probably read more literary fiction than speculative fiction in my life, and yet love speculative fiction, and was raised by, especially my mom, who just has this wonderful sense for things that are quirky and one step removed from reality. So.
Excellent. Okay. Okay. Now I have some questions that are a little bit more specific to your books. So now that you've answered the big picture about genre, you can talk about your own books.
Now that we settled that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now it's done.
It's done.
No, I think we could actually continue talking about it forever, but I was writing down things because there's so much that you all said that I want to think about. Maybe if I have an answer at the end, I'll throw some words out. So all three of your books actually play with these traditions that come before. So the Polish fairy tales came up, the Star Wars Shakespeare came up. So some of this you've already spoken to, but I'd love you to talk about really the way that you use traditions and influences of other works, but also of the real world, to craft into a new story. So, and I know, Robert, you were talking before about animal rights a little bit, and there's a scene that we need to enact at some point. But so those things as well, all of those pieces and how they came together to make this single work. Ian, do you want to start? I don't think I've had you start anything yet.
Okay. So clearly I'm taking the Star Wars movies, which already exist, right? I don't have the hard work of coming up with a plot and characters myself. And so what I was trying to bring to it was, I really wanted to do honor to the Shakespeare side of the mashup, because we've all seen bad Shakespeare parodies, where you kind of add "eth" onto the end of any word and it sounds Shakespearean, right? I wanted to do better than that, and wanted to be really serious about iambic pentameter and getting that right, and serious about rhymes when rhymes came into the picture, and getting his vocabulary right, his grammar right, all of that. So that was sort of one big, thing that I was drawing on. There were things, things that I had to pull from the real world, but about the Star Wars movies, right? There are all these fan controversies out there, right? The most famous of which, did Han Solo shoot first or did Greedo shoot first, right? And so you have to address that in some way. And so getting to play, and also in each book I create a scene that is not in the movie at all, and it's in the original trilogy it's a scene between two Imperial guards, and in the prequel trilogy it's a scene between two Jedi. And in all 6 of those scenes, they're poking fun at the movies themselves, and so that was fun for me to do. Yeah, I'll stop there.
All right, so did Han shoot first in your book?
So what I say, he says he shoots Greedo, and then he says to the bartender, "Pray goodly sir, forgive me for the mess, and whether I shot first on there, confess."
Excellent.
Okay. Real world influences and things. Okay, so when I first pitched this book, I said it was Animal Farm as imagined by Cormac McCarthy and Philip Pullman. So it's a lot of fun. So I think when we talk about, I think the Cormac McCarthy element of that might be the whole issue of how trauma can affect people, and in this case the people are animals, and in this case the trauma is, in a lot of cases, all of a sudden gaining sentience, in some cases killing your master, and then fighting in this long brutal war with these giant ants at your side, and how would that affect these characters years later? Some of them feel guilty about it, some of them are quite proud that they killed their masters, and then some of them are sort of on the fence about it. The Philip Pullman element, Philip Pullman writes a lot about religion. I happen to write, or my day job is working in religious studies. I work, the publishing I do deals with both biblical studies and Islamic studies. I'm really fascinated about the way religion and politics have intertwined in the history of our species, very often with bad consequences, but also with good consequences as well. I mean, it's the flourishing of human imagination and creativity comes from a lot of this partnership. That played a big role in sort of shaping like the big picture of the story, whereas the war and the trauma stuff played a bigger role in shaping sort of the individual characters and the way they looked at the world. So,
Watership Down?
Of course, that played a role in it. Yeah, Watership Down. You know what the problem with a lot of these books is that there isn't. I feel like there isn't enough sex in them, and this is a problem with
the man with a neutered main character.
Right. And Watership Down does have the issue where they realize they actually need to recruit women as part of their group, otherwise, or female rabbits as part of the group, I feel like that's got to be a huge issue for animals that don't have the same inhibitions and who, have these impulses that they've grown up with it, but now they realize like if they're building a society, you can't just act like that all the time. Like that to me was a big issue, and I almost wish I was more of an expert in like that Freudian. Yeah, let's leave it at there. Let's stop there. All right. This is what I say when I start rambling. You have to stop me. All right.
For me, oftentimes I find I don't actually know what the book I'm writing is about until I'm done. A lot of it comes from a sort of unconscious process that pulls in all sorts of elements. The conscious parts of Uprooted for me were that I was pulling in elements of as many fairy tales as I could. And the way that I used that was not in a sort of, I didn't do it in a systematic way, but typically what happened was I would be writing and I'd come to a point where I would have to make a decision. My character had to do the next thing, or there was going to be some effect, some consequence of an action that had just happened. And whenever I'm sorry, I realize that's very vague, but the point of that is whenever I was coming to sort of these moments where as a writer I had to make a choice or a decision, I would generally try and think of something connected to some fairy tale from whatever tradition that I had heard and let that kind of guide me. And that, I think, even if I didn't necessarily spell out or put in directly which fairy tale was guiding me, that was sort of a through line throughout the book. And then when I finished it, I realized that it was very much for me about the story of being the child of immigrants. And that in doing this, that in this process of both setting it in that kind of imagined Poland and in weaving in all these fairy tales and fantasy fiction that I had read in English myself, I was sort of working in a way to reconcile the two halves of my own sort of literary upbringing. And that actually, when we had to make the title as I was working on it was called Dragonborn. But I couldn't actually use that because I published a book with the title Dragon in it. Everybody would think it was one of the Temeraire books. And I didn't want people to get confused and pick it up and think, what? Huh? Where'd Napoleon go? And so it was really interesting to kind of look back and realize what had happened. And then, of course, as I was doing my revisions, I like to revise quite a lot. I went in and pulled out the elements that worked that way for me.
Just a follow-up question for you, Naomi. I noticed the Baba Yaga references, and there's a Robin McKinley sort of Easter egg for anyone who's read McKinley's works. What were some of the other fairy tales that you were consciously playing with?
Well, Beauty and the Beast was a very conscious element. You know, I wanted to play with the idea of one of the things. I don't know how many of you have watched the show Once Upon a Time. So what I loved that they did there was they did the Beauty and the Beast. When they did came time to do Beauty and the Beast, they made the Beast their villain, and I really liked the idea in that of the beastliness not being about, you know, that it's a big furry shaggy monster, or even that it's a beast that looks hideous, but that it's somebody who is acting almost inhuman, that it is somebody who is acting in monstrous ways, and that the process of Beauty and the Beast is, you know, the magic is when that beast becomes human. And so that was kind of the piece that I wanted to capture. There's, of course, you know, there are many stories of a princess hidden behind a wall of thorns, and I went back to that 3 separate times. So there's 3 times that you go into the dark wood and find the princess rescued there. There's a little bit of Pinocchio in there. There's, of course, Hansel and Gretel. There's a Polish fairy tale that probably nobody here has heard of because it's never been translated into English, called Agnieszka Skrawek Nieba, which means Agnieszka, piece of the sky. It's about a little girl who goes into a dark, enchanted forest and rescues her father. And so all of these, I was trying as much as I could to play with fairy tales all the way through.
Thanks. Okay, so each of your books has some thematic overlap. The 3 things I noticed coming up in all 3 books were war, revenge, and friendship, or love. Take your pick. So I was hoping, we'll start with love, friendship, that's the happier one, but I was hoping you could talk about the love stories that are at the hearts of these books, whether they are Morte and Sheba, or I was thinking actually it could be C-3PO and R2-D2. That's my favorite love story. But because it's the tragedy of the Sister Revenge, there's also the dissolution of the epic love story that changes the history of the world with Padme and Anakin. And then there's also the Anakin Obi-Wan relationship. Like, so you've got these moments of love that are falling apart. And in Uprooted, I would say it's both Agnieszka and the dragon, but also Agnieszka and Kasia. Am I saying her name right?
Kasia.
Kasia. So I was hoping you could just talk about those relationships because they are such fantastic relationships.
You know, for me, I very much wanted, in Uprooted, I wanted Agnieszka and Kasia, you know, very often in a lot of fiction, especially when you have sort of 2 female characters, they are often put as rivals to one another, and there's a sense of kind of competition. And I wanted very much to show a real friendship, something that was deeply meaningful. These 2 characters love each other almost like sisters, and how that doesn't mean that that's not a complex relationship, especially in the situation where they grow up believing that Kasia is essentially going to be chosen, that the 2 of them are both sort of up for being taken by the dragon. And they all think Kasia is going to be the one taken, and then Agnieszka is the one who is actually taken. And that this essentially runs through, sort of could easily imagine this driving a wedge into that friendship. And I really wanted to show, that a friendship that can actually surmount something like that and still move forward without sort of ignoring it, without making it all magically okay. And at the same time, you know, the relationship with the dragon, it is very much a kind of almost antagonistic romance, which I always love. I love that thing where you fight and you fight and you fight until suddenly you realize you're in love. That's always one of my favorites. But also Agnieszka in general in the book is somebody who has lots of emotional connections, very deep roots, not just to Kasia. Kasia in the book, I think, does a lot of the sort of front work. She does a lot of the heavy lifting of illustrating that about Agnieszka. But Agnieszka is somebody who's deeply connected to her family, to her village, to her larger community, that she's somebody who believes in those kinds of community, and that was really important to me. That's something that I value and that I think often gets devalued in favor of sort of the hero's journey, which is often turned into a kind of solitary journey. And I very much didn't want Agnieszka's journey to be a solitary one. And that's, yeah.
So I got to play with all kinds of fun relationships. R2-D2 and C3PO certainly is up there in the list, right? Where they don't ever say nice things to each other, but individually they will talk about how much they adore the other. I really enjoy getting into Lando, and because he's pretty one-dimensional in the movies. He's just sort of suave Billy D. Williams, but really you have to imagine that this is a man who is torn up inside by having to betray his friend, and so I got to get into that more. And then these great love stories, two lovers who are antagonistic until they realize that they love each other, Han and Leia, right? And so playing with that, and then getting to harken back to Romeo and Juliet by once they are getting romantic with each other, putting all of their lines in rhyming quatrains in the same way that Romeo and Juliet talk to each other. And then doing the same thing with Anakin and Padme, though there I felt like I was trying to redeem their love story from the movie, because in the movie it's just not convincing. And so trying to help them along, and then getting to show the end of their relationship, where it does start to break down, and in the final scene of the last movie, the final scene between the two of them, where he's accusing her and that sort of thing, the rhyming quatrains that they also have had start to break down, and their rhymes are no longer perfect rhymes, they're imperfect rhymes. And so getting to signal that the relationship changes in that way, in those sort of ways that have more to do with devices than what they're actually saying to each other, was just fun.
Yeah, so the main relationship at the heart of the story is between the cat and the dog, and before this war begins, before they are sentient, the cat is called Sebastian. He later renames himself Morte. And they snuggle in the basement while their two owners, who are, it's a married woman and then her neighbor, while they are having an affair. So their entire relationship is based on this sort of illicit situation, and when the husband comes home and finds out about this, he ends up in a fit of rage doing something really, really terrible. And that's actually the scene. For all the gore and genocide in my book, I've had people complain about that particular scene the most. They're like, well, how could you do that? I'm like, look, that's only, never mind. Well, when you get to it, you'll know what I'm talking about, but there is some animal cruelty in the book. I'll leave it at that. But one of the things that I'm playing with, in the case of Sebastian and Sheba, is the fact that Sebastian is not only a different species, but he's also neutered. Sheba has had children, and Sebastian sort of already realizes that he's sort of not, she's out of his league for a number of reasons. And throughout the book, there are several other relationships that are similar to this, in the sense that one of the characters ends up becoming so attached to this other person that they almost start to worship them. And then you discover that these people that they're worshiping are not, in some ways, that they're a false god. There's a character named Wawa. For those of you from Philadelphia know what that's referring to. Wawa has a dog friend from her days when she was being raised as a dog fighter. She's like a pit fighter, like a pit bull. And she worships this dog, but finds out he's just a slave like she is. There's also a bobcat who forms this very close attachment with the ant queen. Not exactly a love story, but definitely a very tight relationship where they can actually read each other's minds. But that ends up sort of becoming hollow in a way. So a lot of the stories in the book sort of show like both the good and the bad of being so devoted to someone. And in the case of Morte, he eventually, in some ways, he becomes kind of a terrible person because he's so single-minded in his pursuit of finding his friend that he's willing to ditch people in his life who are actually being good to him and who are real, who are actually there in the moment. So that's part of the tension of the book, is like sort of the way Morte sort of becomes inhuman because of the love he has for someone. It's a weird thing I'm trying to play with. I don't know if if I pull it off all the time, but that's what I'm going for. So.
We are pretty much out of time, unfortunately, but so I just was hoping you could all say what is next for you as a concluding question. Start at that end.
Okay. So I just had a novella come out, and it's another science fiction story that takes place in a bombed-out Philadelphia, but it's not part of the Morte universe. But I am wrapping up a sequel to Morte, and then when I'm done the sequel, there will be a spin-off that will come out between the paperback of the first book and the hardcover of the second book. That's the plan. And there will be more crazy animals. There will be a giant spider. There will be a city of beavers. There will be an evil fish people. There's going to be an orangutan who thinks she's Lieutenant Uhura from Star Trek. There's going to be a lot of wackiness. So it's good. The universe will expand, and there'll be more airships and dirigibles. It's going to be great. Okay.
I'm working on a novel of my own that I guess could only describe as being fantasy, even though it takes place here. It's not science fiction. Anyway, there's another Star Wars movie coming out in December, so I think I actually don't know for sure yet, but I think there's a decent chance that it'll end up getting the Shakespearean treatment also.
Great. I have actually just finished writing League of Dragons, which is the final book, the 9th book in the Temeraire series. So that's with my editor now. And I've actually just finished writing a short story that's a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. And that's going to be an anthology called The Starlit Wood, which is going to be all retellings of fairy tales. So if some of you are looking for a book that has multiple retellings of different fairy tales, some of them are going to be like science fictional retellings, some will be traditional fantasy retellings, so it should be a lot of fun. And after that, I have currently about 5 or 6 different ideas all jockeying for which one's going to win, and we'll see which one does.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, panelists. That was fantastic. Can we all give them a round of applause, please? And teachers, I hope that you are all convinced that science fiction and fantasy belongs in your classrooms and libraries, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask me afterwards, because I have a lot of ideas for all of their books, and I've already spoken to most of my own faculty about how we're going to be using these books. So they have legs. There's a lot we could do.